They told you monsters hide in forests. They lied. Sometimes they build farmhouses, pray before meals, and bury their secrets beneath the floorboards. In 1952, in the rolling farmland of Virginia, a respected man named Harlan Vance did something so calculated, so deliberate, that it didn't just scar 17 children. It exposed something darker about power itself. And before we go further, understand this. This is not just a story about one family. This is a story about control, about isolation, about what happens when authority is never questioned. The Vance farm sat miles from town, surrounded by acres of corn that whispered in the wind like conspirators. Neighbors described an unnatural quiet around the property. No laughter, no chaos, no scraped knees or shouted games, just silence. And silence, when it lingers too long, becomes suspicious. Harlan Vance was known as devout, disciplined, a man of principle. He spoke often about corruption in the modern world, about moral decay, about how children needed protection from outside influence. Protection. That word is the first weapon of every tyrant. Because protection justifies isolation, isolation justifies control, and control becomes a cage. For years, rumors floated through the county. The Vances had children, many children, but no one saw them. Not at church, not at school, not in the fields. When asked, Harlan's answers were vague. They're delicate. They're being properly educated. The world is not safe. And in 1950s, rural America, you did not question a father inside his own home. That cultural rule, that sacred boundary around family privacy, became the perfect camouflage. You need to understand something deeper here. Power does not begin with chains. It begins with belief. Belief that one man knows better. Belief that outsiders are corrupt. Belief that obedience is holy. Underneath that farmhouse, 17 children were not just hidden from sunlight. They were hidden from reality. And the man who put them there believed he was righteous. That is the most dangerous kind of evil, because it does not see itself as evil. It sees itself as chosen. We are just beginning the descent. And the further we go, the more you'll realize. This was never just about one underground cellar. It was about a mindset. And that mindset still exists.
The first thing you must understand is this. No one builds a prison overnight. Harlan Vance did not wake up one morning and decide to bury 17 children beneath his home. This was constructed slowly, methodically, like all systems of control. In the years leading up to 1952, the Vance farm transformed, not visibly, but structurally. Deliveries of lumber that didn't match any new barn construction, late-night digging sounds masked by generators, soil that appeared freshly turned near the foundation, then carefully disguised. Neighbors noticed. But noticing is not the same as acting. And here is where the real lesson begins. Communities often sense evil before they confront it. They feel it, but they rationalize it. It's not my business. He's just strict. Every family is different. 17 children lived beneath that house for years. Not days, not weeks, years. Which means the system worked. The underground chambers were not crude holes. They were reinforced with timber beams. Ventilation shafts were carved upward, hidden in tree lines. Food was lowered through concealed hatches. The space was divided into sleeping quarters and a common area. This was architecture of confinement. That kind of structure requires planning. Planning requires intent. Intent reveals ideology. Harlan preached constantly about corruption. He believed modern schools were indoctrination centers. He believed media poisoned innocence. He believed the government was spiritually compromised. Sound familiar? When fear of the outside world becomes absolute, isolation becomes logical. And once you isolate a mind from competing ideas, you own it. The children were taught only what he allowed, scripture filtered through his interpretation, morality defined by his voice, reality shaped by his narrative. No alternative perspectives, no dissent, no witnesses. Do you see the pattern? Control information, control environment, control identity. This is how psychological empires are built. And once built, they sustain themselves through fear. The children feared the outside world because they were told it was evil. They feared disobedience because punishment was swift. They feared curiosity because questions were sin. Fear is a more efficient lock than iron. But here's what makes this story darker. Some of those children were not biologically his. Some had disappeared from struggling families across county lines. Runaways, they were told. Lost. Gone. But not gone. Acquired. You must ask yourself, how does a man convince parents to surrender a child? Through authority, through performance, through presenting himself as a moral superior. Predators do not look like monsters. They look like solutions. And Harlan Vance positioned himself as salvation. This is where we descend further, because underground chambers are physical prisons, but ideological prisons, those are harder to detect and far more common.
You want to know how a man hides 17 children underground for years? He doesn't just dig tunnels. He engineers silence. Silence in his home, silence in his wife, silence in his neighbors, silence in the culture around him. Dorcas Vance was not born into darkness. She married into it. At first, Harlan's intensity looked like conviction. His sermons at the dinner table sounded like strength. His suspicion of the outside world felt protective. But intensity, when unchecked, mutates into domination. Over time, Dorcas stopped going into town. Harlan said the women there were frivolous, corrupt, bad influences. She didn't argue. Isolation rarely feels like imprisonment at first. It feels like loyalty. The farm became their entire universe. Supplies were purchased in bulk to avoid frequent trips. Windows were shuttered more often. Visitors were discouraged. Church attendance faded. And under the house, the digging began. At first, it was storage expansion, then storm shelter reinforcement, then simply, don't ask. Here's what most people misunderstand about control systems. They require participation from the controlled. Dorcas cooked for the children underground. She lowered food. She cleaned bedding. She tended to illnesses. But she did so under surveillance. Harlan monitored everything, every word, every glance, every hesitation. Authoritarian men understand something ancient. Control the mother, you control the children. If she rebels, the system fractures. If she submits, the system stabilizes. Dorcas's breaking point didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It was erosion, slow psychological erosion. Years of being told the outside world was wicked. Years of hearing that obedience was holy. Years of watching her husband's temper sharpen whenever questioned. Fear became her oxygen. And above ground, the illusion held. Neighbors saw a disciplined household. They saw a devout man. They saw prosperity. What they did not see was the architecture of indoctrination. The children underground were taught a singular narrative. The world above is evil. Your father is your protector. Silence is virtue. Obedience is survival. When you eliminate external reference points, reality becomes whatever the authority declares it to be. This is not just family dysfunction. This is psychological statecraft. 17 minds shaped in darkness. 17 identities rewritten. You think this can't happen again? It happens anywhere information is monopolized, anywhere fear is amplified, anywhere one voice becomes the only voice. The tunnels under the Vance farm were not just dirt corridors, they were pipelines of ideology. And we haven't even reached the moment of discovery yet, because when truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive gently, it erupted.
Every prison has a flaw, not in its walls, in its noise. In August of 1952, the flaw was a sound. A traveling preacher, invited for supper, nothing more, sat at the Vance table while cicadas screamed outside in the humid fields of Virginia. The meal was plain, the conversation controlled. Harlan spoke, Dorcas nodded. And then it happened. A muffled thud beneath the floorboards. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. The preacher paused. Harlan did not. That detail matters. When something unnatural occurs and one person refuses to react, you are witnessing rehearsed denial. Moments later came the second sound, a whimper, short, quickly stifled. Dorcas froze. Harlan cleared his throat and launched into a lecture about moral decay, about how modern society corrupts innocence. He spoke louder than necessary. Volume is often used to drown out truth. The preacher left unsettled. He could have dismissed it. He could have rationalized it as rodents or settling beams. But something in Dorcas's eyes stayed with him. Terror mixed with pleading. And here is where the story shifts, because evil depends on bystanders. It feeds on hesitation. It survives on discomfort. But sometimes one man decides the silence is heavier than the confrontation. The next morning, the preacher went to the county sheriff. And understand this clearly, he was risking his reputation. In rural 1950s America, accusing a respected father of hidden wrongdoing was social suicide. You could destroy your ministry with one false alarm. But he spoke anyway. This is the pivot point in every tyranny, when someone breaks rank, when someone chooses truth over comfort. The sheriff listened. He had heard rumors before, the unseen children, the late-night digging, the isolation. But rumors are fog. This was smoke, and smoke means fire. Still, even then, action was not immediate. There were legal barriers, cultural resistance, fear of overreach, the sacred doctrine of a man's home is his castle. And that doctrine protected Harlan Vance for years. Remember this lesson. Systems of abuse survive not because they are invisible, but because they are inconvenient to confront. The sheriff began gathering testimony quietly, cross-checking missing child reports, speaking to families in neighboring counties. Patterns emerged. Boys who vanished after temporary farm work, children sent away for religious upbringing, parents too poor to fight back. 17. That number did not appear overnight. It accumulated like interest on moral debt. And when the warrant was finally signed, it would not just open a hatch in the floor. It would open something far more dangerous, public awareness. And once awareness awakens, control begins to fracture. When the sheriff arrived at the Vance farm with a signed warrant, the air felt heavier than the August heat. Authority had finally met authority. Harlan stood on his porch, tall, composed, Bible in hand, a performance of righteousness. He did not shout at first.
He questioned calmly, asked about legal overreach, spoke of religious persecution. Understand this tactic. When cornered, control systems reframe themselves as victims. The sheriff presented the warrant. Harlan's jaw tightened. Dorcas appeared behind him. And this is the moment history pivoted. Because when pressure meets fear long enough, something breaks. The deputies stepped inside. The house was immaculate, too immaculate. No toys, no clutter, no evidence of life beyond two adults. But silence is not emptiness. Silence can be concealment. The sheriff walked slowly across the entryway floor. His boots paused over a section of wood that felt slightly hollow. Years of law work sharpen instinct. He tapped again. Different tone. He knelt, and then Dorcas began to sob, not soft crying, convulsive, from somewhere deep and buried. "No more," she whispered. "They'll find them." They. That word shattered the last illusion. The deputies restrained Harlan as he lunged forward, no longer composed, no longer righteous, just desperate. The floorboard hatch was concealed expertly, a seam almost invisible, a latch disguised within the grain of wood. It opened with resistance, and from below came the smell. Earth, stale air, human confinement. The lantern light cut into darkness like a blade, and what it revealed was not chaos, it was structure, a hand-dug tunnel descending into the soil beneath the farmhouse, reinforced beams, ventilation shafts carved carefully upward. This was not panic construction, this was infrastructure. Years of digging, years of planning, years of maintaining a world beneath a world. The sheriff descended first. Every step downward was a step into something ancient, something primal. The air grew warmer, thicker, and then the tunnel widened. 17 pairs of eyes reflected the lantern light, not screaming, not rushing, just staring. That silence again, not the silence of peace, the silence of conditioning. Children between the ages of 4 and 17, pale skin, thin limbs, clothes worn past threadbare, some shielding their eyes from the brightness, some trembling, some simply blank. The sheriff counted, 17. Above ground, the cornfields swayed in the wind as they always had. The sun shone, the world continued, and beneath it, for years, a separate kingdom had existed, built not on love, but on absolute control. And here is where the story deepens, because what Harlan Vance created underground,
When the children were led into the sunlight, many of them collapsed to their knees, not from weakness alone, from overload. Imagine living your entire life beneath wooden beams and packed earth, and then suddenly being confronted with sky, infinite blue, wind, noise, space. Freedom is disorienting when you've been trained to fear it. Doctors later documented extreme vitamin deficiencies, fragile bones, stunted growth, severe malnutrition. But the physical damage was only the surface layer. The deeper wound was psychological architecture. Harlan had not merely hidden them, he had rewritten them. Interviews conducted in the days after the discovery revealed something chilling. The children did not refer to the underground chambers as a prison. They called it the sanctuary. That word did not originate from them, it was implanted. Language shapes reality. If you rename a cage a sanctuary, resistance dissolves. They believed the outside world was poisoned, that sunlight corrupted the soul, that outsiders were wolves in human skin. They feared the sheriff more than they feared their father. That is mastery-level conditioning. You see, true control does not rely on constant punishment. It relies on internalized obedience. Harlan positioned himself not as a tyrant, but as a prophet. He told them the government was fallen, schools were indoctrination factories, neighbors were spiritually diseased. And because they had no competing information, his narrative became absolute truth. This is the blueprint used throughout history. Isolate, indoctrinate, reinforce fear, reward submission, punish curiosity. 17 children digging their own underground expansion, believing they were building something holy. That detail matters. They participated in maintaining their confinement. When a captive helps fortify the cage, the system becomes self-sustaining. Halfway through this descent, I want you to do something intentional. In the comments, write this phrase twice. I see through the veil. Write it 2 times. Not for engagement, for commitment. Because awareness begins with declaration. You are not here just to hear a story. You are here to sharpen perception. Back to the chambers. Among the 17, 5 were confirmed biological children of Harlan and Dorcas. The remaining 12? Acquired. Through manipulation, through persuasion, through targeting families in financial desperation. Harlan presented himself as a religious benefactor. He offered education, spiritual protection, stability. To struggling parents, he looked like opportunity.
The sheriff's lantern cut through the darkness, revealing the hand-dug walls, timber supports, and the dim, cramped rooms where 17 lives had been suspended. But notice this. The physical confinement was almost secondary. The real prison was mental. Harmon Vance had engineered compliance with meticulous precision. Every child knew that a wrong glance, a word of defiance, a question spoken too loudly would invite wrath. Yet he rarely had to strike. The threat alone was sufficient. Obedience had become instinct. Fear was internalized. And here's the darkest part. The children were coerced into maintaining their own underground world. They shoveled, swept, carried water, organized meager rations. They reinforced the walls, repaired breaches, and even constructed ventilation shafts. They were prisoners and jailers simultaneously. Their labor created both survival and deeper captivity. This is a tactic that powerful figures throughout history understand intuitively. Systems of control are most effective when those who are oppressed participate in their own oppression. When you shape the environment, the rules, and the perception of danger, the cage becomes invisible, and the prisoner becomes invested in it. Medical teams, when they finally examined the children, noted the staggering psychological effects: extreme social withdrawal, blank staring, a near-total inability to interact with adults normally, and hypervigilance. They flinched at loud noises, avoided eye contact, and clung desperately to one another. Many had developed what psychologists would later classify as post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1952, there was no terminology. There was only the stark horror of witnessing human minds bent, fractured, and remade by one man's obsession. Yet, amidst all of this, there was one common thread: survival. Those who survived learned the unspoken law of the Vance Underground: silence above all, observation, obedience, endurance. A few whispered to one another in darkness, developing their own fractured language, small rebellions within the walls, but the overarching structure remained intact. And here's the key lesson: power is most absolute when unseen. Harlan Vance's dominion was not marked by chains or bars, but by belief, fear, and isolation. It was psychological, invisible. And that is the blueprint that repeats in families, corporations, and institutions even today. Think of this. How many obedient people are silently sustaining the very structures that confine them, believing it is for their own good? How many are building their own cage, plank by plank, brick by brick, under the illusion of protection? This is where the story stops being just about the Vances. It becomes a meditation on human control, and we are only scratching the surface.
Descending deeper into the Vance labyrinth, the full scale of Harlan's design became horrifyingly clear. This was no simple cellar. The tunnels twisted like a maze beneath the earth, leading to interconnected rooms, each meticulously planned. There were sleeping quarters, storage, and even a crude kitchen. Every detail reflected a mind obsessed with permanence, with control, with total dominion. And yet, what is truly unsettling is not just the physical ingenuity, it's the philosophy underpinning it. Harlan Vance believed that the world above was irredeemably corrupt, that every other human being outside his walls was a threat to purity. He wasn't merely hiding children, he was creating an alternate reality, one that he could dictate entirely. And within this reality, he was God. Consider the psychological implications. These children had no temporal reference. Days, weeks, seasons, they were abstract, irrelevant. The sun, the sky, the natural rhythm of life, replaced by dim oil lamps, cold earth, and a rigid hierarchy of obedience. Time itself becomes a tool of control. When a person cannot anchor themselves in natural cycles, their mind bends to the will of the architect of their confinement. And here, the pattern reveals itself. Extreme isolation plus manufactured routine equals complete domination of the psyche. Harlan's method wasn't brute force, it was insidious, a slow erosion of independence. The children learned that to survive was to submit was to live, to question was unthinkable. The medical observers later described it clinically: severe malnutrition, stunted growth, and profound emotional detachment. But beyond the measurable physical effects lay a deeper horror. Identity had been suppressed, individuality replaced by collective obedience, curiosity punished, fear internalized. Childhood itself had been weaponized against them. Now, imagine the long-term consequences. Even after rescue, the trauma persisted. Eyes that had never seen sunlight, lungs unused to open air, hearts conditioned to panic at the slightest sound. Their first steps above ground were not liberation, they were disorientation, anxiety, mistrust, and a lifelong echo of subterranean terror. And here is where the lesson deepens, far beyond 1952 Virginia. Psychological control doesn't require walls, chains, or physical punishment. It thrives on isolation, fear, and the illusion of protection. Those who master this can bend others without them ever realizing they are bound. It is invisible, pervasive, and devastating. Think of the systems around you. Families, organizations, governments. How often are behaviors conditioned through subtle threats, routine, and isolation from context? How often are individuals participating in the very structures that limit them, thinking it is for their own good? Now, if you understand this truth, type in the comments, "I see the cage," twice. Twice to anchor it, twice to claim awareness. This is not idle, it is symbolic. It locks in the first stage of transformation. Awareness is the beginning, but the descent into truth has only just begun.
The deeper you go, the more the illusion of normalcy shatters. In the Vance underground, you see not only the physical scars of captivity, but the architecture of control itself, carefully engineered to break resistance before it could form. Every tunnel, every low ceiling, every musty corner was a lesson: obedience, silence, invisibility. The children were not merely hidden, They were systematically stripped of agency. Harlan Vance's approach reveals a universal principle. The most effective domination is subtle. Physical confinement is the blunt instrument, psychological confinement the scalpel. Here, in these narrow, hand-dug corridors, you witness the mechanics of invisible oppression. Children learn to fear shadows, not just adults. They learn that the world outside is unknowable and unsafe. Trust becomes an act of courage, curiosity, a sin, silence, survival. Yet consider the cunning of it. Harlan did not raise monsters in the obvious sense. He raised compliant minds, minds that could think, observe, and calculate, but only within the parameters he dictated. He weaponized obedience. Every shovel in the dirt, every meal rationed, every task completed underground reinforced his dominion. Labor became devotion, routine became indoctrination, and fear became faith. Step back for a moment and ask yourself, how many systems in our lives function in precisely this way? How often are rules, routines, and invisible hierarchies accepted because rebellion feels impossible, dangerous, or morally wrong? Harlan Vance understood a truth often ignored. Control that feels benevolent, righteous, or protective is far more effective than chains or brute force. And here lies the sinister beauty of his method. He blended fanaticism with meticulous care. The children, though suffering, were clothed, fed, and instructed. In their world he was both tyrant and caretaker, God and jailer, protector and oppressor. Their confusion, their submission was not an accident, it was his design. As the lanterns flicker over their pale, hollow faces, the lesson crystallizes. Domination thrives not in violence alone, but in shaping perception, in controlling knowledge, in defining reality. Once the mind believes the boundaries are real, the cage exists, even if the walls are invisible. The rescue changed their bodies, but could it erase the programming of decades underground? Their trauma would ripple for years, proof that control imprints deeper than the skin. And for those of us watching, the true horror is not just what Harlan did, it's what this story teaches about the nature of power, obedience, and the fragility of human autonomy. If you are ready to acknowledge the hidden cages in your own life, write again in the comments, "I see the cage," twice. Solidify it, recognize it, claim awareness. The descent is far from over. Each revelation strips another layer of illusion, revealing a world where freedom is earned, not given.
Now, step closer, because this is where the story begins to reveal its darker architecture. Harlan Vance's delusion was not a single moment of madness. It was a carefully constructed ideology, a self-made gospel that justified unspeakable acts. To him, the children were vessels, blank slates upon which he could imprint a version of the world that existed only in his mind. Every rule, every punishment, every act of concealment served that ultimate purpose: total control over reality, total control over perception. Consider the psychological machinery at work. Children underground for years, isolated from sun, laughter, and social norms. What emerges is more than fear. It is a form of cognitive conditioning, a rewiring of instinct. Harlan's world is absolute. Obedience is survival. Questioning is sin. Exposure to truth is forbidden. The mind learns its boundaries by the limits imposed, internalizing authority until the line between reality and imposed narrative dissolves. You might think, this is extreme, such horrors are rare. But pay attention. Look at history. Look at institutions. Look at societies. Everywhere there are hidden chambers of control, not always physical, often ideological, where obedience is cultivated, dissent punished, and reality shaped by those in power.
Harlan Vance's farm is an extreme example, a microcosm of a pattern repeated across time and place. And notice the elegance of his system. The children are taught work as devotion, labor as morality. They are given structure, routine, even scripture, yet stripped of choice. Every moment underground reinforces that the world outside is corrupt, dangerous, and forbidden. He transforms confinement into indoctrination. He makes fear a lesson, obedience a virtue, and silence the highest form of achievement. Here you start to understand the subtle terror. It is not the shovels, the tunnels, or the darkness alone. It is the way the human spirit can be quietly reshaped, how perception can be hijacked, how autonomy can be stripped without chains. This is the blueprint of domination, psychological, ideological, and systemic. Harlan Vance did not simply hide children. He hid truth, he hid empathy, he hid freedom. And in doing so, he revealed a universal principle. The greatest prisons are not built of wood or stone. They are built of rules, fear, and belief. To internalize this, to acknowledge the hidden structures shaping your own life, write it twice. I am awake to control. Feel the words. Let them mark your awareness. This is not just history. This is a mirror, and the descent into understanding has only just begun.
The next layer of this horror is the spatial manipulation, how Vance turned Earth itself into an instrument of domination. These tunnels were not just hiding places, they were a controlled environment, a meticulously engineered prison designed to distort the senses. Days and nights blurred together underground, time lost meaning. The children's circadian rhythms vanished, replaced by Harlan's arbitrary schedule. Hunger, thirst, cold, and dampness were calibrated to break the natural resistance of body and mind, to teach dependence, obedience, and submission. Notice how isolation amplifies power. A single adult above ground holds authority over 17 lives below. Every decision, every movement, every morsel of food, he controls it. The children's world shrinks until it exists only in response to his will. The psychological principle is ancient. Control space, control perception. Control perception, control reality. The tunnels are more than soil and timber. They are an invisible web of influence, a laboratory of domination where Harlan Vance experiments on the human psyche. But there is a deeper, darker layer here. Observe the paradox. Vance saw himself as a savior, a protector of sin, a spiritual architect of innocence. Yet the tools of protection, darkness, deprivation, labor, became the instruments of oppression. This is the mirror of all institutional corruption. The line between care and control, protection and imprisonment, can be invisible to those who wield power. As you listen, imagine the children emerging from the darkness for the first time, the sun blind, the wind alien, the air unfamiliar, and yet they have been trained, conditioned to obey, to fear, to measure life not by freedom, but by survival within imposed boundaries. And the psychological scars run deeper than any physical malnutrition. They are coded into thought, into instinct, into identity itself. We must ask ourselves, how often does society allow subterranean control to flourish unnoticed? Not always beneath houses, but beneath norms, beliefs, laws, and structures, hidden, normalized, unquestioned. Power cultivates its own darkness, and those in it often cannot see how far it stretches or the lives it ensnares. Now internalize this. Think of control as a force that doesn't always announce itself with violence or chains. Sometimes it whispers through isolation, through routine, through fear disguised as guidance. And know this, once recognized, awareness is a weapon. Write it twice, aloud or in your mind. I am awake to manipulation.
Feel the weight of understanding settle. You are now deeper into the machinery of hidden power, and the descent continues.
The descent grows heavier now, because the truth extends beyond the soil and timber into the very ideology that justified it. Harlan Vance was not a random sadist. He was a calculated architect of belief. Every rule, every punishment, every lesson in those underground rooms was designed to shape perception, to rewrite morality, to create a microcosm of his own distorted order. He built not just a prison, but a reality where he alone defined right and wrong, good and evil. Consider the mechanics: obedience through fear, enforced silence, constant labor. The children were taught that questioning him, seeing the outside, or even dreaming beyond his rules was sin. And so the mind, malleable and desperate for structure, began to internalize these truths. A generation conditioned to equate suffering with righteousness. This is psychological control at its purest, subtle, invisible, yet absolute. Harlan's fanaticism becomes a lens through which every act of cruelty is reframed as salvation. Now, look at the ethical inversion. Harlan's logic: the outside world is corrupt. By isolating these children, I am saving them. Yet in saving them, he destroys them. Identity is stripped, innocence is twisted, trust is weaponized. This is the paradox of moral fanaticism. The zeal to protect justifies acts that any rational mind would recognize as monstrous. It is the breeding ground for hidden horrors in all institutions where power goes unchecked, where ideology supersedes humanity. And here's the most dangerous part. The children, having no other reference, accept this world as normal. Their reality is dictated by one mind, one will. The moral compass becomes absolute obedience. The outside, freedom, empathy, curiosity, these become foreign, even threatening. This is a blueprint for control that has repeated itself throughout history. Cults, tyrannies, manipulative hierarchies, all use the same tools, just on different scales. Now, feel the weight of recognition. Power often hides beneath righteousness. Control often hides beneath guidance. Deception is woven into care. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Whisper or write it twice. I see the hidden chains. Let it resonate. You are now witnessing not only the horrors underground, but the architecture of dominance that manipulates mind, morality, and perception. The descent deepens.
The tunnel system beneath the Vance farm was more than a physical prison. It was a psychological labyrinth. Each narrow passage, each hidden chamber, each reinforced wall served a dual purpose: containment of bodies and containment of minds. Every footstep, every muffled sound, every flicker of the lantern was measured, controlled, and manipulated to maintain dominance. Harlan Vance understood instinctively that power over the mind is far more enduring than power over the body. Notice the timing of the work: years of meticulous excavation, shoring up walls, designing ventilation, all under the guise of normalcy above ground. The sophistication implies premeditation, foresight, and patience. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. It was a long-term operation in psychological engineering. The children were not only imprisoned, they were educated into fear. Every action enforced his worldview. Obedience equals survival, silence equals virtue, the world outside equals danger. Consider the subtle horrors in this environment: artificial darkness, enforced labor, isolation from sunlight, absence of play, absence of nurturing. These aren't just physical deprivations, they are the tools of mental reshaping.
The human brain, especially in children, craves stimulus, social interaction, and normalcy. Remove those, and you create a malleable, pliable consciousness. They become vessels for the ideas of the captor, conditioned to perceive the cage as sanctuary. Now understand the broader implication. This is a blueprint for systemic control. What was happening in Virginia in 1952 mirrors mechanisms used by cults, authoritarian regimes, and manipulative organizations throughout history. The methods differ, the scale differs, but the principle is identical. Isolate, condition, and dominate the mind until obedience is internalized. Harlan Vance's underground labyrinth was a laboratory of obedience, a dark experiment in control disguised as salvation. And here is where most observers fail. They see only the surface. The true danger is invisible. Chains that cannot be seen are the most binding of all. When fear, indoctrination, and isolation are fused, the captives themselves police their own behavior. They become complicit in their confinement, unaware of the possibility of liberation. That is the hallmark of masterful psychological control. Now breathe in this understanding. Recognize it when you see it disguised as protection, guidance, or righteousness. Whisper it twice. I see the hidden chains. Let it sink, because the deeper truths are now beginning to reveal themselves.
As you stare into the shadows of the Vance farm, consider this. The underground chambers were more than a prison. They were a carefully orchestrated ecosystem of control. Harlan Vance had built a microcosm in which he was God, judge, and jailer simultaneously. Every schedule, every meal, every movement was a mechanism of compliance. There was no randomness, no freedom. Every act, even the most mundane, reinforced his authority and further entrenched the children in submission. Notice the conditioning. In total darkness, children learn to suppress curiosity. In enforced labor, they internalize obedience. In isolation, they construct their reality from the only cues available: his voice, his rules, his worldview. Harlan's approach mirrors psychological conditioning methods seen in secretive institutions and cultic environments. What looks like discipline is in reality meticulous behavioral engineering. Every minor infraction punished, every small compliance rewarded, an invisible code they could not escape. The Vance operation also demonstrates the terrifying power of secrecy. Above ground, they were an ordinary, even pious family. Neighbors heard nothing, saw nothing, questioned nothing. Silence became a weapon, not just for Harlan, but for the structure he imposed. Community compliance, born from deference, fear, and social norms, enabled the horrors beneath. This is a pattern repeated throughout history. Atrocities flourish where vigilance is absent, where people prefer polite distance to probing inquiry. Now, consider the children themselves. By the time they were discovered, their identities had been systematically reshaped. Names, routines, even their understanding of the outside world were subverted. Their sense of self had been fused to the authority of one man. To them, Harlan's will was not coercion, it was reality. This is the essence of total domination. The prisoner no longer resists because the prisoner is convinced resistance is unthinkable. And the horror, the truly profound horror, is that this can happen anywhere, because human nature obeys systems more readily than it obeys truth. One charismatic authority, one doctrine, one isolated environment, and entire lives can be rewritten in silence. Harlan Vance was not a unique aberration. He was an archetype, a model of what happens when power goes unchecked, when moral illusions conceal systemic manipulation. Take this understanding deep. Recognize the subtle mechanisms when they appear in families, institutions, even cultures.
Whisper it twice, aloud or in thought. I see the hidden chains. Let it settle. Awareness is the first act of resistance.
Beneath that farmhouse, the air was thick with more than dust and damp. It was thick with years of fear compressed into living bodies. 17 children, each a testament to the power of control, each a silent archive of human malleability. Look closely at what Harlan Vance had created, not just a prison, but a self-reinforcing system. Fear bred obedience, obedience bred silence, silence bred total psychological submission. And once you understand this, you see the pattern in every story of hidden domination throughout history. Notice the meticulousness. Ventilation shafts disguised among tree roots, tunnels hand-dug over decades, separate chambers for sleeping, eating, even rudimentary instruction. This was not haphazard cruelty. This was calculated, almost clinical. Every structural choice was a tool for maintaining authority and suppressing dissent. Harlan had become both architect and warden, designing a living environment that molded behavior, that reduced autonomy to the barest minimum. The children's responses were predictable, yet haunting. Many recoiled at human touch. Many had forgotten the sound of their own voices. Some, especially the older ones, had internalized rules they did not fully understand. Never speak without permission, never look up, never ask why. Over time, their sense of self was compressed to mere survival. In psychological terms, what we see here is learned helplessness taken to a terrifying extreme, a perfect storm of isolation, fear, and control that erases individuality. But remember, Harlan's power extended beyond the tunnels. Above ground, he was respected, even admired. The facade of a godly, industrious man protected him from scrutiny. And therein lies a lesson in manipulation. The most insidious forms often hide behind legitimacy, piety, and outward success. The world above the ground did not see the chains beneath it. They didn't have to. Obedience to authority and the comfort of ignoring suspicion completed the cycle. History is littered with such structures, systems of hidden compliance and unseen oppression. Institutions, families, cults, governments, all have leveraged fear, silence, and controlled information to create their own underground worlds, invisible to outsiders. And when you understand this, you start seeing it everywhere. Patterns of control, layers of secrecy, the careful engineering of consent. Whisper it again, twice, and feel it take root. I see the hidden chains. This is no longer a story. It is a lens, a filter through which to examine every facade, every system of obedience. Awareness is dangerous, yes, but it is the only way to break the cycle.
Now, step even deeper. Consider Dorcas Vance, not merely a bystander, but a co-opted participant, a human vector of control. Her terror was real, but so was her complicity, forced as it was. The line between victim and enforcer is often blurred in systems of domination. The psychology of submission is a masterclass in exploitation. The oppressor leverages love, fear, guilt, and religious devotion to mold the enforcer, to make them a willing extension of the prison itself. Dorcas's trembling hands, her muted voice, her moments of silent despair, these were tools in Harlan's arsenal. Every glance of obedience reinforced his authority. Every suppressed scream tightened the invisible bonds. And the children? They learned from her. They internalized not just fear, but the imperative to obey without question. Authority was omnipresent, both in the rigid figure of the patriarch above ground and in the terrified mother below, a psychological echo chamber of submission. Look closer. The design of the underground chambers mirrored the architecture of obedience. Narrow passages, low ceilings, limited light, all engineered not merely for concealment, but for psychological compression. Bodies pressed close together, minds pressed down, identity pressed flat.
Harlan understood instinctively that environment shapes behavior. He built a world where independence was impossible, where curiosity became fear, where hope became a dangerous anomaly. And here's the critical truth most never see. Systems like this do not rely solely on physical restraint. The real power lies in conditioning. Control the perception of reality, limit choice, dictate narrative, and you can bend entire populations, children, adults, even entire societies to your will. The underground labyrinth was a microcosm of that principle. The children did not need chains or locks. The fear, the silence, the orchestrated obedience did the work far more efficiently. History repeats. Harlan's tunnels are not anomalies, they are parables. Every authoritarian system, every cult, every totalitarian institution, every hidden conspiracy in human history leverages the same levers: isolation, psychological manipulation, controlled exposure, and the illusion of choice. Humanity's dark ingenuity in control is both astonishing and terrifying. Now, I want you to feel it in your bones. Whisper it twice to anchor the awareness. I see the hidden chains. Say it slowly. Let it sink. This is the moment where passive knowledge becomes active perception. Once seen, you can never unsee. Once known, the world above ground appears as a labyrinth itself, filled with unseen corridors, hidden hierarchies, and subtle dominions waiting to be recognized.
Step further, into the shadows where the real horror hides, not in the acts themselves, but in the system that allowed them to persist for years. Think of the neighbors, the county officials, the casual observers who turned away, whispered politely, or dismissed their intuition. Their silence was not just social convention, it was complicity by inattention. Civilization itself, when built on trust and deference, becomes fertile ground for hidden corruption. Sheriff Halt's careful, methodical investigation reveals the anatomy of delayed justice. Evidence had been staring them in the face for decades: birth records, absences, rumors. But human systems are designed to favor appearances over reality. Harlan's reputation as a devout, prosperous, unyielding man functioned like a shield, a carefully crafted narrative. The better someone performs virtue on the surface, the more blind society becomes to the darkness they harbor underneath. Observe closely. The mechanics of concealment are both practical and psychological. Above ground, the farm was immaculate, cultivated, serene, proof to outsiders that life was orderly. Underground, the labyrinth grew, hidden yet functional, a microcosm of power and obedience. Every plank, every hand-dug tunnel, every crude mattress was both a physical barrier and a psychological instrument. Harlan's genius lay in his ability to merge the practical with the abstract, to create a world that trapped bodies and minds simultaneously. The children themselves became both evidence and instruments of the system. Their silenced voices, malnourished bodies, and conditioned obedience reinforced the narrative of normalcy above ground. They were invisible in society, but present enough to maintain the illusion of a large, pious family. Each step, each glance, each suppressed cry was a reinforcement of the invisible hierarchy that controlled them. Ask yourself, how many systems around us operate on the same principles: authority cloaked in virtue, obedience enforced through fear, compliance hidden beneath routine? Families, corporations, governments, religious institutions, each a potential labyrinth. Knowledge is the first light into these tunnels, and awareness the key that unlocks them. And now, to seal this perception in your mind, repeat it with me twice.
I see the hidden hierarchies. Feel it settle. This is no mere historical curiosity. This is a lesson in the architecture of power. Once recognized, the surface of the world can never again be trusted at face value. The unseen corridors, the whispered commands, the subtle manipulations, they are everywhere, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look.
The underground chambers were not just prisons, they were classrooms of control. Every routine imposed by Harlan Vance was a lesson in obedience, a conditioning of the mind that ensured absolute compliance. The children learned quickly. Silence equaled safety, labor equaled survival, and deviation equaled punishment. Over years, their bodies grew frail, but their fear and submission became strong. In that darkness, morality itself was rewritten. They internalized the rules of their captor as absolute truth. Consider the psychology at work here. A child removed from sunlight, social interaction, and play does not merely suffer physically, they are sculpted into a state of hypervigilance. Every glance of an adult, every unspoken warning, every minor correction becomes amplified. The brain adapts to scarcity of information, creating a heightened sensitivity to authority, a permanent imprint of obedience. Harlan was both the architect and the executioner of this conditioning. In his mind, it was divine duty. In theirs, it became reality. Now, reflect on the implications beyond the farm. Systems of control rarely need overt brutality to be effective. Fear, isolation, ritualized obedience, these are the invisible levers of power. When applied over time, they can reshape minds, bend wills, and suppress the instinct to question. The Vance farm was extreme, but the principle is universal. Notice it in everyday life, in hierarchical organizations, in institutions that demand compliance, in ideologies that punish curiosity. The tools may change, but the method remains consistent. Isolate, control, and normalize submission. The discovery of these children, decades later, was not merely a rescue, it was an unveiling of a suppressed world. Each child, fragile and silent, represented not only years of captivity, but the psychological architecture of control made flesh. For every story like this, countless others remain hidden, unseen, and unexamined. Power, when unchecked and cloaked in virtue, can create entire underground realities invisible to the world above. And here lies a crucial truth for you, the observer. Recognizing the mechanism of control is only the first step. Awareness without action is complicit in its own way. Understanding the invisible threads that bind, the subtle forces that manipulate, grants you a rare advantage, the ability to see the world not as it is presented, but as it is orchestrated. Now, to anchor this awakening, repeat aloud twice, I break the chains of hidden control. Feel the resonance. The world will never again appear as merely surface and light. Beneath every facade, every polite deference, lies a structure of influence, a system of power that shapes perception, thought, and behavior. Those who see it and act with clarity gain not just knowledge, but freedom. As Sheriff Halt descended into the dark labyrinth beneath the Vance farmhouse, he entered not just a physical space, but a psychological theater. Each tunnel, each low-ceilinged room was carefully designed to manipulate perception, to create a reality where the captor held absolute authority. The children, pale and silent, had internalized every rule, every restriction to the point where the world above, the sunlight, the open sky, the wind in the trees was alien, even threatening. Their minds had been meticulously reshaped to survive in darkness, not to thrive in light. This was the essence of systemic control. When fear is constant and options are removed, reality itself becomes a prison.
Imagine years spent in such conditions, where even the smallest act of curiosity is punished, where obedience is the only pathway to relief. Over time, the very concept of self-direction erodes. Autonomy becomes a memory, a dangerous thought that is quickly extinguished by the mechanisms of fear and authority. Harlan Vance had mastered not just confinement, but mental engineering. The tools were simple yet devastating: isolation, monotony, and ritual. Every day had a pattern, every command reinforced the hierarchy. Obedience became a lifeline, silence became instinctive. Doubt, misbehavior, or disobedience were immediately corrected, internalizing a permanent state of self-monitoring. By the time authorities uncovered this hidden world, the children were not just captives of the earth, they were captives of their own conditioned minds. The real horror was that even freedom might feel unfamiliar, threatening, and unnatural. And this is where the story deepens, where it begins to speak to truths far beyond a single farm in Virginia. Consider the structures that govern our societies today: schools, corporations, governments. How often do we encounter systems designed to subtly limit inquiry, to reward compliance, to normalize fear of deviation? The mechanics are similar: isolate, instill dependence, make the forbidden invisible, then shape perception so that the rules appear natural, moral, or necessary. Harlan Vance's underground world was extreme, but the principle scales. Control does not always shout, it whispers, invisibly, shaping minds over time. You are witnessing this not just as a story, but as a lesson in awareness. Observe the patterns, the unspoken rules, the silent forces that shape behavior around you. The first step to liberation is seeing the architecture of control. Once you recognize it, you can begin to untangle yourself, to reclaim thought, action, and identity. Now, anchor this awareness with power. Repeat aloud twice, "I see the hidden structures of control." Feel the shift. The world above, once assumed to be neutral, reveals itself as a landscape of subtle influence, waiting to be understood, and, for those brave enough, to be transcended.
Sheriff Halt moved cautiously through the dim corridors, the lantern casting grotesque shadows along the earthen walls. Each step revealed another room, another chamber carved from soil and timber, a testament to years of meticulous planning. Here, beneath the quiet farm above, the Vance children lived in a world designed to erase innocence, to suppress identity, to normalize fear. It was a psychological ecosystem as much as a physical one, and every detail served a purpose: the cramped spaces, the constant darkness, the rhythmic routines. They weren't mere hardships, they were instruments of conditioning. Notice how fear becomes a language of power. When children are confined to darkness, when their choices are stripped away, when their perception of normal life is systematically distorted, the mind adapts. Adaptation in this context is obedience. Curiosity becomes suspicion. Independence becomes perilous. Harlan Vance, with his rigid ideology and twisted sense of duty, engineered not just a prison, but a mechanism for molding thought itself. He became a living law, a divine arbiter in the children's subterranean universe. This is the blueprint of domination. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. Control is most effective when invisible, when the captives believe the limits are natural or inevitable. Silence, repetition, isolation, these are the tools of shaping minds. Years pass and the boundaries of freedom blur until the very concept of choice feels dangerous. By the time Halt's lantern revealed the children's gaunt faces, their wide, unblinking eyes, it was clear that the prison had reached into their souls. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Harlan Vance believed he was saving the children. He cloaked coercion in morality, cruelty in divine purpose.
And therein lies the most dangerous form of manipulation. When authority claims righteousness, the mind doubts its instincts. The world above, bright and expansive, was reframed as corrupt, as threatening. Darkness, confinement, and silence became synonymous with safety. This revelation should awaken something inside you. Ask yourself, where in your life do invisible rules dictate behavior? Where does fear masquerade as protection? Where is obedience rewarded while curiosity punished? Recognizing these structures is the first act of defiance. Awareness is the spark that ignites resistance, the first step in reclaiming autonomy. And now, anchor this realization. Repeat aloud twice. I reclaim my awareness. I resist hidden control. Feel it resonate. The subterranean world of the Vance children is more than a historical horror. It is a mirror, reflecting the subtle, insidious ways control shapes lives in every era.
The children's eyes told a story that words could barely capture. Some stared blankly, as if the very act of seeing had been dulled by years underground. Others clutched one another, silent anchors in a world they'd never truly known. And yet, within that terror, a flicker of recognition sparked, a recognition of possibility, of freedom, of the outside world they had been denied. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. Step back and consider the scale of this manipulation. Harlan Vance didn't simply hide children, he erased their reference points for reality. Time above ground, seasons, sunlight, the sounds of animals or the wind, all these were absent. Their reality was measured in footsteps, whispered instructions, and the muted rhythm of survival. The mind, in such conditions, recalibrates. Memory bends, identity fractures. Fear becomes the framework through which the world is understood. This is a profound psychological truth. Humans adapt to the cages in which they are placed, not only physically, but mentally, emotionally, even morally. The Vance children's world, imposed by a single mind driven by fanaticism, demonstrates how fragile autonomy can become when external control is absolute. And it is here, in the subtle war between the imposed reality and the natural instinct to survive, that the most insidious power lies. Sheriff Halt, observing these children, understood that rescue was only the beginning. Extraction from their underground world would not immediately return them to freedom. Their minds had been trained to obey, to fear, to silence themselves. Every step above ground, every breath of open air, every encounter with the living light of the sun was a confrontation with a lifetime of conditioning. Healing would require patience, understanding, and above all, the recognition that trauma of this magnitude leaves unseen chains long after the visible ones are removed. The Vance farm, its fields green and sunlit above, concealed a testament to human ingenuity twisted toward darkness. Here is the ultimate lesson of this story. The most effective prisons are not always made of walls and locks. They are built from belief, fear, and enforced obedience. And even decades later, the echoes of that control linger, reminding us that power is most dangerous when it masquerades as care, as morality, as protection. Look closely at your own world. Where do unseen structures shape thought? Where do authority, fear, or doctrine quietly dictate behavior without your conscious awareness? Recognizing the mechanisms is the first step to reclaiming autonomy, the first step to understanding the shadows that lie beneath.